In this joint work with Clay Thomas and Matt Weinberg, we characterize off-chain influence proof transaction fee mechanisms. Before getting into the details, I'll quickly give a what to expect from this talk. So we'll be looking at transaction fee mechanisms, which are basically auctions that miners or block proposers in blockchain use to sell space in the block to users. So when miners propose a block, the real estate in the block technically belongs to the miner, and transaction fee mechanisms are going to be the way through which they monetize the space on their block when selling it to users. So at a high level, the transaction fee mechanism exists on chain that facilitates selling space to users. But on the other hand, that does not restrict how the miner can sell their space on the block. They can go off to Twitter and then say, hey, you know what, bid here, and then I'll tell you how to bid on chain, and otherwise I'm not going to let you in. So in this talk, we are going to look at a desiderator called off-chain influence proofness that basically says, okay, look, it should be revenue optimal for the miner to entirely stick on-chain and not go off-band to communicate with the users at all. So the goal for this talk is going to be to characterize off-chain influence proof mechanisms, and more generally, for any transaction fee mechanism that is run on-chain, what the off-chain equilibrium that the miner will want to induce will be. Before getting into the details of off-chain influence proofness, we'll take a small detour into a narrative on designing protocols versus designing mechanisms. So protocols, by definition, are like the literal letter of the law. So it's the algorithm that we design when designing some new platform. As a running example, we'll be looking at longest chain consensus that Bitcoin uses. Without going into a lot of details, basically Bitcoin elects one miner every round to propose the next block. The miner has to choose a block and then attach their block on top of a block that already exists on the chain. The hope is that Bitcoin would want miners to attach their block at the tip of the longest chain, thereby extending the longest chain even more by one. But on the other hand, miners have the freedom to choose whatever block they want and then attach their block anywhere. And every block that the miner proposes that ends up being on the longest chain will earn the miner a block reward, some reward for doing the work to propose this block. So this is the literal letter of the law that Bitcoin tells its users and miners on how it is being run. The mechanism, on the other hand, consists of both the protocol and how strategic agents respond to this protocol. Right? So continuing on the longest chain example. So as I mentioned before, while Bitcoin hopes that miner continue to build on at the tip of the longest chain, miners can still choose to attach their block pretty much anywhere on the chain. And once again, Bitcoin hopes that as soon as they propose a block, they announce the block to the entire network. Like they don't sit on the block for some while and then delay it. Whereas nothing really stops the miner from delaying broadcast of blocks. So when designing any decentralized system, right? The designer can end up designing only the protocol, but can't micromanage the details of the mechanism, right? Like all the platform designer can do is come up with the rules, the literal letter of the law, and that would only end up shepherding users towards the way you want them to behave, but it can't really command users to behave in a particular way. If that is the case, why do we even care about designing protocols? Well, the design of a good protocol would impose constraints on the resulting mechanism. It will constrain the set of actions that agents can play in the resulting mechanism. For example, once again, in longest chain consensus, the constraints imposed can be of different flavors, right? So to be elected as a leader in each round, the miner will have to solve some kind of a cryptographic hash puzzle. And the constraint that the protocol imposes on this is that it is just computationally hard for miners to invert a hash function. So constraints can be cryptographic of this form. So it can just come from computational hardness, or it can be through incentives. So in this example, the only way through which a miner can earn rewards is if they end up proposing a block that ends up on the longest chain. So they can do like 73 different things, but the only way through which they can earn rewards is if they can push their block onto the longest chain. So understanding the conflict between the design of the longest chain consensus protocol and the resulting mechanism was like the starting point for a long list of literature on selfish mining, starting with the seminal work of Eyal and Seidel. Okay, so with this context out of the way, the goal of this talk is to understand this protocol versus mechanism conflict in transaction fee mechanisms. So as I had mentioned earlier, transaction fee mechanisms are mechanisms that are run so that miners can monetize space on their block while selling it to users so that they can include their transactions and have them processed. The traditional view of transaction fee mechanisms so far, stemming from Roughgarden's work in 2020 and Chung et in 23 and a huge line of literature, looks at TFMs as a combination of three rules. Right? So when users submit their bids to the miner, and when the transaction fee mechanism is called on these bids, three things are computed. The first is, okay, for these bids, which subset of users to include in the block and with what probabilities. And the second is for the included users, how much do we charge them? And finally, how much of the payments to burn. This is where transaction fee mechanisms fundamentally differ from auctions. You don't have to pass on all the payments to the auctioneer, to the miner. Some of them can be burnt, and the residue is passed on as revenue to the miner. So one high-profile example is EIP 1559, which is Ethereum's TFM. It is basically a posted price mechanism at price P. Every user willing to bid more than P is included in the block, and each included user is charged P. This is like going to a grocery store and buying biscuits at $5. Like if you're willing to pay more than 5, you pay 5 and bring the biscuit packet back with you. The signature of EIP 1559 is that like the entire revenue is burnt and the miner gets zero revenue. All right. So one key observation about transaction fee mechanism is the role that the miner plays. Right? The miner is basically the intermediary, the gatekeeper between users and the transaction fee mechanism. The users don't touch that transaction fee mechanism directly. The only way they could interact with the TFM is through the miner. And this observation forms the basis of our protocol versus mechanism lens for transaction fee mechanisms. Okay. Now to run through this protocol versus mechanism lens, we'll first have to understand the constraints imposed by the transaction fee mechanism on the users and the miner. Now we'll apply our observation that the TFM does not interact directly with the users at all. So the only way through which it can impose constraints is by restraining what the miner can do. So particularly, what can the miner do? The miner can go off-chain, run its own auction, and then decide the following based on the bids that it sees off-chain. It can say, okay, look, I see the bids V1, V2, V3, V4 off-chain. I'll try to get you this allocation on-chain. So I say, okay, look, you have to bid this way on-chain, otherwise I'm just not going to include you people on-chain. So the TFM cannot really constrain the miner based on users' bids, but rather it just says, okay, look, if you want to allocate your users according to the probabilities X, which is like X1, X2, so on till Xn if there are n users, you will have to burn B in order to get this allocation for the users. So in some sense, indirectly, the TFM imposes the constraint X on the users because the only thing that users care about is how much allocation they get. And then it says, okay, in order to get this allocation, you'll have to burn B. So the burn is the constraint that it directly imposes on the miner. In particular, the payment that it charges from the users is not a constraint. Why? Because any payment that it charges on-chain, if the miner thinks that's way too much, it can reimburse users off-chain, or it can collect more payments from the users off-chain. So it is not a binding constraint in terms of what is being lost by the collective of users and the miner. So for example, if you look at EIP 1559 again, in order to allocate n users, the miner will have to burn n times P. There is no other way for the miner to process n different transactions. Conditioned on this, the miner is free to do whatever it wants to include the users who bid, right? So the miner can say, okay, look, you have to bid P on chain, but you have to give me an additional tip of delta off chain if you want to get included. So this way, for every included user, the miner can earn a payment of P plus delta minus the burnt P. So the miner earns a revenue of delta per allocated user. So for the rest of the talk, this motivates looking at burn as some kind of a production cost imposed on the miner. So miner sees a menu for some indexing that set theta. It sees like pairs x theta comma b theta, which basically says, okay, look, if you want to induce the allocation x theta 1 to user 1, x theta 2 to user 2, and so on, you'll have to burn, you have a production cost b theta to create that block x theta. So as long as the miner creates a block supported by this menu, the miner is free to charge whatever payments off chain, and the miner is free to run whatever mechanism it wants. Okay. So now that we have connected the problem of the best off-chain mechanism to run with running an auction with production costs, in order to understand revenue maximization, we'll have to go back to traditional revenue optimization theory, starting all the way from Meyerson's virtual value framework. So revenue maximization is inherently tricky because it has to take into account, okay, what payment rules are we charging to the users? How will users respond strategically? What is the production cost associated, and so on. On the other hand, welfare maximization, which I'll define shortly, basically is a more algorithmic problem. It turns out, due to a really nice result, that when optimizing for welfare, you don't have to separately take care of incentives. So in this slide, we'll quickly find a way to reduce revenue maximization to the easier problem of welfare maximization. So we'll go over the setting quickly for both the TFM problem and a more traditional auction theory setting. There are n users with values v equals v1 through vn. And we live in an average case world where these values are drawn IID from a distribution T. We assume that this distribution is regular. It's more a technical assumption. We don't have to worry about the details. Okay, so in equilibrium, users need not bid truthfully. Users can be strategic. That's the entire point of protocols versus mechanism. So suppose that in equilibrium, when user 1 sees a value v1, they bid, so according to some bidding function, b1 of v1 and b2 of v2 for user 2, and so on. So when the users see values v1 through vn, and when they bid b1 of v1, b2 of v2, all the way through bn of vn, let's suppose that the users are allocated according to x of v on realizing the values v. Similarly, users are charged payment p of v in equilibrium. And finally, the auctioneer or the miner faces a production cost b of v. The revenue maximization problem is the following. So we want to maximize the expected revenue that the miner gets, which is basically for each v, we sum over all payments charged to each of the users minus the production cost that the miner faces for allocating these users. As I mentioned earlier, this problem is a little bit tricky because it is not clear what payment to charge and what payments are charged in equilibrium according to the equilibrium bidding strategy and so on. However, the welfare optimization problem is the following. It just says, okay, look, what is the value created for the users? When user I has value vi, it gets a value of vi per unit item. It gets allocated with probability xi of v. So the user gets a value vi times xi of v. We sum over the total value per users minus the production cost. So optimizing for welfare is a purely algorithmic problem. So we just look over the menu of all possible x comma b pairs supported by the mechanism. And then we take the maximum over all such pairs for a given v. The magic of virtual values is the following. It reduces the expected payment problem to an expected welfare maximization problem. So this says there exists a very nice virtual value function phi such that optimizing for payment or the expected payment is basically equal to the welfare of the mechanism, assuming that the users have value phi of vi instead of vi. So here we look at the virtual value created, that is phi of vi times xi minus the production cost, and we take the sum of all of it. For this talk, we'll assume that, and this paper, we'll assume that the virtual value function is increasing. That is basically the regularity assumption, and that it is also continuous. Most common distributions, like the uniform distribution, normal distribution, and all satisfies this property. Okay, so now we'll put this reduction from revenue maximization to virtual welfare maximization to use. To this end, this is the first theorem that we'll claim. The miner optimizing its expected revenue in the TFM, the off-chain TFM problem, actually reduces to a multi-item single buyer setting where, with n heterogeneous items, where the single buyer has values phi of v1 for the first item, phi of v2 for the second item, and all the way through phi of vn for the nth item. The proof is as follows. Remember that the miner or the auctioneer, when optimizing for revenue, is basically solving for a welfare optimization problem. And as I had mentioned earlier, welfare optimization is a purely algorithmic problem. So given a bunch of values, or in this case, given a bunch of virtual values, the miner basically runs over all possible menus of x theta comma b theta supported by the TFM, and it picks x of v comma b of v that maximizes its virtual welfare. It turns out the multi-item single buyer setting is fairly similar. When there are n items and one buyer, and when the buyer has value v given by v1 for getting 1 unit of the first item, v2 for 1 unit of the second item, and so on, the buyer will basically pick an item from the menu of the mechanism so as to maximize its utility, which is value times allocation minus the payment that it makes. So in some sense, the virtual welfare in the transaction fee mechanism looks pretty similar to the utility of a buyer in a multi-item single buyer setting. Once again, if you replace the value with virtual values, you go back from the multi-item single buyer environment back to the TFM. We'll go over a quick example with EIP 1559 again. So to quickly remind you of this, for a burn P, EIP 1559 basically says, okay, the miner will have to burn P units or burn P for every user that it allocates. We'll assume it's an infinite block. That is, there is no constraint on the number of users the miner can allocate. And on an infinite block, basically all the miner can do is post some price tau and then include all users that bid more than tau and charge them the price tau. Remember that tau need not be equal to P. So in this setting, revenue maximization looks like the following. When the miner posts a price tau, the user gets included whenever its value beats, Vi is greater than or equal to tau. So the probability that a user is included is probability that Vi is greater than or equal to tau. And whenever the user is included, it makes a payment tau. So the miner gets a payment of tau, but will have to pay a production cost P. So from each included user, the miner makes an expected revenue of tau minus P times the probability that the user's value beats tau. So applying virtual values here, whenever the user faces a value Vi, assuming that the user gets included, the miner gets a virtual value of phi of Vi minus the production cost P that it has to pay. So the indicator function says, okay, look, this phi of Vi minus P is basically what the miner gets whenever Vi beats tau. If Vi does not beat tau, the user is not included, and therefore the miner gets 0 from this user. And we sum over all users because we want to calculate the total expected virtual welfare for the miner. The optimal mechanism here is going to be the following. The miner will want to include user Vi whenever phi of Vi minus P gives a positive outcome for the miner. In other words, the virtual welfare from item I, from user I, must be more valuable than the production cost for including that user. So what will the miner do? They will include phi of Vi only if phi of Vi is more than P. Or in other words, at the threshold tau, phi of tau must be equal to P. Or specifically, this motivates the following way of looking at TFMs. The miner is basically buying slots from the blockchain, and then it's like including users in the slots it just bought. So it pays P for each slot that it has bought that it bought from the blockchain. And all users that bid that give back the user more than P in virtual welfare are included in the blockchain. All right. So with the motivation out of the way, we'll get to one of the two main theorems of this talk. So now we are ready to characterize the equilibrium allocation and the equilibrium burn of any transaction fee mechanism. So in equilibrium, including any off-chain mechanism that the miner can run, we'll prove that there exists a concave utility function u such that the equilibrium allocation rule x is basically the gradient of u at the values v. However, note that here, when we take the gradient, we take the derivative with respect to the virtual value phi of v and not just v. Okay, so this characterizes the allocation rule. And the burn rule is basically characterized by the virtual values dot times the allocation rule or the gradient of the function u minus the utility function u of v. The exact values or the exact characterization is not important, but more importantly, there exists a utility function u that basically characterizes the allocation rule and the burn rule that is realized in equilibrium. The proof kind of follows immediately from our multi-item single buyer reduction. So this is due to Roche in his 1985 paper. In any multi-item single buyer auction, he argues that there exists a concave utility function u such that the equilibrium allocation and burn is the gradient of u, and the payment is the dot product of v and the gradient minus the utility function itself. So the theorem is basically applying Roche's theorem, but in virtual values to the TFM environment. All right. So given this characterization, now we'll go back to the traditional view of transaction fee mechanisms and then apply them there. So traditionally, Roughgarden defined three desiderata, out of which we'll stick to two, of what a good transaction fee mechanism must satisfy. The three of these are in line with making bidding easy for the users. So the first of them is what we call on-chain user simplicity. This is similar to user incentive compatibility, UIC, defined by Roughgarden. This just says, okay, look, it must be optimal for user I to bid its value VI truthfully, irrespective of how other users bid in this auction. The next one is called on-chain miner simplicity. This is similar to myopic miner incentive compatibility, MMIC, from Roughgarden 2020. This says it must be optimal for the miner to not censor or fabricate bids. Note that this is different from the off-chain mechanism that we are talking about, because here it's like users bid whatever they want to bid, and then the miner blindsides them by censoring bids and fabricating bids out of nowhere. However, when running an off-chain mechanism, the miner basically says, okay, look, this is what I'm going to do on-chain. Now go ahead, adjust your strategies and bid in equilibrium. So this is on-chain miner simplicity. And finally, off-chain influence proofness. This is due to our previous work. This argues that the miner should not be able to increase its revenue by running its own revenue own mechanism off-chain. So for the remainder of this talk, we'll prove the other main result of our paper, that there are very specific mechanisms that can satisfy all three of these desiderata. Or specifically, if we restrict the mechanism to be anonymous and deterministic, the only such mechanism that is anonymous, deterministic, and satisfies on-chain user and miner simple, and is also off-chain influence proof, must be a posted price mechanism. Before going into the details, note the following. The posted price mechanism requires an infinite block because for whatever capacity the block is, if two more users are willing to pay the price, you will have to include them. So you can't run a posted price mechanism with a bounded capacity. This means the only anonymous deterministic TFM satisfying all these three desiderata needs an infinite block. Okay, we'll get into the proof. So for the first step, we'll identify deterministic anonymous truthful multi-item auctions. So deterministic anonymous comes from basically the TFM setting. The truthful is a combination of, okay, look, you want the users to report their values truthfully on chain, and you don't want the miner to step in and then say, okay, look, do not report your values truthfully on chain, bid strategically, and then we'll do things off chain. So that is where the truthfulness comes, where the TFM needs to be reported the virtual values truthfully. Okay, So in multi-item auctions, the only deterministic and truthful mechanism that you can run is basically by doing bundle pricing. You just say, okay, for any bundle of items S that you want to choose, there is a price phi of S that is being posted. You can pay this price and pick your favorite bundle. So now when we add anonymity on top, this basically says, okay, look, now all bundles of the same size must be priced the same. In other words, all users, or if exactly 5 users are to be included, the price that is charged by the production cost that is charged by the TFM must not be dependent on the identity of the user. So any deterministic, truthful, and anonymous TFM or a multi-item auction must basically be like, okay, if you want to buy a bundle of T items, you have to pay a price of 5T. So in that sense, then the miner's optimal strategy is going to be, okay, look, let's enumerate users in decreasing order of values, v1 through vn. We had assumed that the virtual value function is monotone increasing. This also enumerates users in decreasing order of virtual values. Now the miner just says, okay, look, if I want to allocate one user, that will be the highest virtual valued user. What is the price, the production cost I have to pay? And what is my virtual surplus? Okay, if I want to include the top 2 users, what is my virtual surplus minus production cost? Top 3 users, top 4 users, and so on. So for whatever T that maximizes its virtual welfare, the miner picks that T and builds a block with the top T users in terms of virtual values. Okay, so this characterizes all anonymous deterministic TFMs, truthful TFMs. And in the next slide, we will start worrying about the other desiderata. We'll start worrying about on-chain user simple and on-chain miner simple. Okay, so for the second step, we'll prove that the marginal burn, which is phi of t minus phi of t minus 1. This is the difference in the production cost charged to the miner for including the tth user into the blockchain. We'll argue that this cannot increase. Remember that when we were looking at EIP 1559, which is posted price, the burn was n times p to include n users. So the marginal burn, the burn to include the nth user, is n times p minus n minus 1 times p, which is p. So the posted price mechanism is a constant marginal burn. So we'll first show that the marginal burn cannot increase. And in the paper, we'll show that the marginal burn cannot decrease either. Okay, we'll assume for contradiction that there exists some point where the marginal burn actually increases. So up to like for delta phi 1 to delta phi t, it's like strictly decreasing. And delta phi t plus 1 where the marginal burn actually increases for the first time. We'll do a proof by picture and let's assume t plus 1 is 4. So the marginal burn decreases for the first 3 burns and then it increases for the fourth user. So we'll consider this scenario where the highest valued user has value v of 1, which is slightly above delta phi 1. Now the virtual value is slightly above delta phi 1. And similarly, the virtual value of the second highest valued user, phi of v2 is slightly above delta phi 2, and delta phi of v3 is slightly above delta phi 3. So now we'll argue that placing a strategic fake bid, the miner will be able to increase its revenue. To do that, we'll quickly review a theorem by Meyerson, which characterizes truthful payments in mechanisms. It argues for the mechanism to be truthful, we'll have to charge each user I the smallest bid bi that it needs to bid in order to get allocated. So in this example, we'll calculate the smallest bid bi that user 3 will have to pay so that it gets allocated. So here we'll argue that the smallest bid is phi inverse of delta phi 3. So why is that the case? Now look at phi of v1. The miner will want to include the highest valued user because phi of v1 minus delta phi 1 is positive. Similarly, phi of v2 minus delta phi 2 is also positive, and therefore the miner will want to include the first 2 bits come what may. So now in order to allocate the third bid, the smallest that the third user will have to bid, it will have to beat its virtual value in comparison to delta phi 3. So its virtual value must be more than delta phi 3, which happens at phi inverse of delta phi 3. So the smallest bid that user 3 will have to pay is phi inverse of delta phi 3. Okay. Now consider throwing in a fake bid. The miner throws in a fake bid, v hat, with virtual value phi of v hat slightly smaller than delta phi 4 and also slightly smaller than phi of v3. Now, what does this imply? Now look at what will happen in this setting. Phi of v4 will not get included because the production cost to include phi of v4 is delta phi 4, which is more than phi of v4. So the first three users will continue to get allocated. However, the smallest bid that phi of v3 will have to bid so that it gets allocated is not delta phi 3 anymore. Why? Three bids will get included. And what will be the third bid? The third highest bid must beat phi of v4 in order to get allocated now. If it bids lesser than phi of v4, instead of the third highest bid, phi of v4 will get in, and bids 1, 2, and phi of v hat will get allocated. Therefore, the new payment is now v hat, which, as you can notice, is more than phi inverse of delta phi 3, because phi of v hat is more than delta phi 3 according to this graph. So by throwing in a fake bid, the miner is actually able to increase the payment that it gets from the third user. The idea is similar, but in the paper we also prove that the payments from phi of v1 and phi of v2 also do not decrease. All right. So it remains to prove that the marginal burn, now that it cannot increase, we also prove that it cannot decrease either in the paper. Sorry for the typo here. In the paper, we also show that the marginal burn cannot decrease either, and therefore it is a posted price mechanism. So this concludes the proof that the only anonymous deterministic TFM satisfying on-chain user and miner simplicity and off-chain influence proofness is a posted price mechanism. And recall once again, as I had mentioned, that a posted price mechanism needs an infinite block space. So now the next question is, okay, can we do anything at all with finite block space, probably through randomization? So in our paper, we design randomized transaction fee mechanisms that satisfy all of the three desiderata for finite block size if the distribution is bounded. And we leave the same question open for unbounded distributions. All right. So this brings us to the summary of the talk. So in our talk, we looked at the protocol versus mechanism lens. That is, in any decentralized system, the platform designer can basically design the protocol to shepherd a particular behavior from the user, but it cannot directly micromanage how users behave. And then we apply this protocol for mechanism lens for TFM. So a quick two-line summary is that the constraints that the TFM imposes on the miner and user is that for each block that can be built, it imposes a production cost on the miner. And for this constraint that the TFM sets on the miners and user, we characterize all off-chain mechanisms, equilibrium off-chain mechanisms, where the miner maximizes its revenue. So from there on, it's basically a reduction to production in auction theory with production costs and multi-item single buyer settings. So this concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening so far. Thanks a lot.